when stability was chosen over fairness. The decision was framed as necessary. The consequences were anything but equal, and once the choice was made, there was no clean way back. To understand why stability was chosen over fairness, we have to revisit moments when collapse felt imminent. In those moments, leaders were forced to decide who would be protected first, the system or the individual, the market or the public. These choices were rarely announced as moral trade-offs. They were presented as technical necessities. Today, the results of those decisions still shape public trust. Bailouts, guarantees, and rescue stabilized markets, but they also created lasting resentment. Many Americans watched institutions survive, while households struggled. Stability returned, but fairness felt postponed. At the time, officials argued there was no alternative. Allowing large institutions to fail would spread damage instantly. Jobs, savings, pensions, and credit would disappear together. Protecting the system meant protecting everyone, even if it didn't look that way. But that logic hid an uncomfortable truth. Stability is easier to measure than fairness. Markets respond quickly. People do not. The system recovered on paper long before lives recovered in reality. This gap became the foundation of a deeper tension. A belief that rules changed when stakes were high enough, that some actors were shielded while others absorbed the cost. Over time, that perception hardened. What began as crisis management evolved into a defining feature of modern banking. Stability was no longer just a goal, it was a priority. And once fairness was delayed, it became increasingly difficult to restore. As stability took precedence, the structure of intervention followed predictable lines. Support flowed toward institutions deemed essential, those whose failure could trigger wider collapse. The logic was systemic, not personal, but its effects were deeply personal. Banks received capital, liquidity, and guarantees. Markets steadied. Credit resumed. Yet for individuals, relief moved slower and arrived thinner. Lost jobs were not instantly replaced. Homes were not immediately saved. The system recovered first. People followed later. This imbalance reshaped how fairness was understood. Officially, interventions were neutral tools. In practice, they favored scale, access, and proximity to power. Large institutions had direct channels. Smaller actors navigated delays, conditions, and uncertainty. Public explanations focused on inevitability. There was no time to design perfect solutions. Speed mattered more than symmetry. Every hour of delay risked cascading failure. Fairness, officials argued, could be addressed once stability returned. But stability has a way of redefining the finish line. Once markets calmed, urgency faded. Temporary inequalities hardened into permanent outcomes. Winners consolidated positions. Losers absorbed losses quietly. This created a silent shift in expectations. Crises were no longer moments when everyone shared pain. They became moments when protection was selective, predictable, structured around importance rather than impact. Over time, this pattern altered trust, not just in banks, but in the rules themselves. If fairness could be deferred indefinitely, then stability began to feel less like protection and more like preference. And that perception would not disappear easily. The conflict deepened as these choices repeated across crises. Each intervention reinforced the same hierarchy. Institutions first, stability first, fairness later. Over time, this sequence stopped feeling temporary and started feeling intentional. Inside the system, the reasoning remained consistent. Saving key institutions prevented wider damage. But outside the system, the pattern looked different. It looked like protection for those who already had it. Risk-taking was cushioned at the top, while consequences flowed downward. This perception mattered. Banking depends on trust not just in money, but in rules. When people believe the rules bend unevenly, confidence shifts, not into panic, but into skepticism. Participation becomes cautious. Anger replaces fear. Policymakers attempted adjustments, new regulations, stress tests, consumer protections. These measures aimed to restore balance without sacrificing stability, but they operated within the same framework. The system still revolved around preventing collapse above all else. Meanwhile, banks adapted faster than rules. They learned how to operate within protections, how to grow without appearing fragile, how to remain essential. Fairness became a secondary variable, discussed after calm returned never before. This tension reached an emotional peak during moments of recovery. Markets rebounded, profits returned, bonuses reappeared. Yet many households were still rebuilding. The contrast was stark. Stability looked successful. Fairness looked absent. The question was no longer whether stability should matter. It was whether a system could remain legitimate when stability consistently arrived without fairness, and whether confidence, once strained this way, could ever fully recover. The climax came not in another collapse, but in recognition. The recognition that stability had become the system's shield, and fairness its unresolved promise. Markets were calm, institutions were intact, but trust had changed shape. Over time, this imbalance reshaped public expectations. People no longer assumed crises would be shared equally. They assumed protection would flow upward first. That belief altered behavior in subtle ways. Engagement declined. Cynicism grew. Confidence remained, but it was thinner. Yet the system persisted, because stability, even unevenly distributed, proved powerful enough to prevent breakdown. And once collapse was avoided repeatedly, the framework hardened. Fairness became something discussed in hindsight, not engineered in advance. Today, American banking still reflects that choice. The priority remains preventing systemic failure. The lesson absorbed was clear. A stable system, even if imperfect, is preferable to chaos that treats everyone equally. But the cost of that choice continues to echo. Every intervention reinforces the same question: how long can stability stand without restoring fairness alongside it? What happened was not just crisis management. It was a redefinition of what success looked like, and that definition still guides decisions today. There is one further dimension to this trade-off that rarely enters the official account. Stability and fairness are not simply competing values. They operate on different timescales. Stability produces results in days and weeks. Fairness produces results in years and decades. The urgency of crisis compresses time. Decisions made in compressed time favor the faster reward, and systems built on those decisions and defend them as having been the only rational choice. But rational for whom? And over what time frame? Those are questions the official account of stability tends to avoid, because answering them honestly would require acknowledging that the definition of success used during a crisis is not the only definition available, only the most convenient one, the one that produces visible results fastest, the one that justifies the next intervention before the previous one has been fully evaluated. Fairness moves too slowly to compete in that environment, which is why it loses, not because it is less important, but because it is less urgent. And urgency in moments of crisis is the only currency that matters. That is what makes the choice so difficult to reverse afterward. Once urgency defines the terms, everything else is measured against it. And fairness, patient and slow and distributed, never quite meets the standard. That stability set in the moment when no one had time to argue for anything else. So what do you think? Are we repeating the same mistake again? The answer, unfortunately, is yes, not because the people making the decisions are indifferent to fairness, but because the structure of crisis response makes fairness structurally inaccessible. At the moment when the most consequential choices are made, the window in which stability is chosen over fairness is also the window in which there is genuinely no time to do otherwise. And then that window closes, and the choices made inside it become the new baseline, which is why the question of fairness must be answered before the crisis, in the design of systems, in the rules that govern intervention, in the structures that determine who is essential and who is exposed. If those decisions are made during calm, they can account for fairness. If they are made during crisis, they cannot, because crisis leaves no time for the slower, more distributed, less visible rewards. That fairness eventually produces, only for the immediate, concentrated, measurable rewards, that stability delivers in days. Understanding that is not pessimism. It is the beginning of designing systems that do not force the choice between stability and fairness in the first place. Systems that can deliver both, not perfectly, but deliberately, And that deliberateness is the only thing that separates policy from emergency, intention from reaction, and a system that serves everyone from one that protects only those it cannot afford to lose. When